Last time, we went over all the religions in the Roman Empire. We looked at sort of standard Roman paganism with their various gods and emperor worship. Then we spent some time looking at the mystery cults, all the sort of weird, secret cults. They were actually very popular and presented a good bit of competition to early Christianity. Now, today we're going to move on and look at philosophy. And philosophy is actually really important because, again, most of the religions of the day were very amoral. The religions were a set of rituals and things you did to appease the gods. They didn't make any real demands of you outside of that. So your religion didn't so much determine what you believed about what was right and wrong. It didn't determine what you believed as to how the world worked. That was all the realm of philosophy. And so in a lot of ways, the philosophy of the period was much more of a competitor to early Christianity than the other religions were. And in fact, there are a lot of things in the New Testament that are very much direct answers to the popular philosophies of the day. And you might not notice it unless you know what those philosophies were. And philosophy was very popular, even though philosophers were oftentimes seen as odd. And a lot of times the philosophers would sort of breed, intentionally, give that kind of odd appearance so that they could appear enlightened and appear as though they presented great wisdom.
Aren't the philosophers these days odd too?
Don't tell Richard that. We have some friends who are philosophers, like professional philosophers, like Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary and the like. And yeah, Richard would probably be okay with being called weird.
I think so.
But so philosophy was really, one more thing in the marketplace of ideas. So you had all these different religions coming from all over the empire and outside the empire. You had astrology and superstition, and philosophy sort of got thrown into all of that. And again, the usual way people would work back then was they wouldn't pick one thing and sort of devote themselves to it. They would pick what they liked from a bunch of different possibilities and sort of build their own philosophy. But there were some philosophical schools that were more sort of exclusive. Some of them, like the Epicureans and the Pythagoreans, we'll talk about them, actually would live in community and hold all things in common, very similar to the way that the early church did. And so, really, you can understand the early church as much in the framework of a philosophical school as it was a religious movement, in that not only did it, was it purporting to explain the nature of God, but it also purported to explain the nature of reality and morality, which were seen much more as the realm of philosophy. So one of the most popular philosophies, and ones that really does get addressed a good bit in the New Testament, is Platonism, or what really by the time of the early church was what was called Neoplatonism. Because Plato had existed several centuries before, and his ideas had sort of shifted and mutated over time, so that what you had in the first century AD was generally called Neoplatonism. It wasn't exactly like what Plato had taught. But the idea with Plato, his basic idea, was that he believed that the material world was transient, it was imperfect, it wasn't really that real. Plato did not see the physical world as being the real world. He saw the spiritual world as being the only true existence. And that spiritual concepts, what he called ideas or forms, were what were permanent and real. And basically, he taught that the physical world is modeled on these spiritual forms. Like, you're sitting in a chair right now. Well, what makes a chair a chair? Well, a chair is a chair because it conforms to this spiritual form, this spiritual reality of the true ultimate chair. And your chairs are good chairs insofar as they conform to that ultimate chair reality. So that was sort of his idea of, the way the world worked. The spiritual realm was truly real. The physical realm was just an imperfect shadow of the spiritual world. There's a rather famous illustration called Plato's Cave, where he talked about that. And this idea was a big sort of threat to early Christianity, this dismissal of the material world in favor of the spiritual. And this was in direct contradiction to Judaism and early Christianity, because, Judaism taught, and therefore early Christianity taught, that the physical world was real, that it was created good by God, and that it mattered. And, but you start to see more and more as time went on that Christians began to adopt this Neoplatonic idea that the spiritual world was the real world. And you still get that nowadays. You still get, think of how many Christians say things like, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. The idea that, the physical world isn't that important. It's not real. It's spiritual heaven that's real. And you get a lot of Christians even nowadays who have these ideas which aren't rooted in the New Testament. They're rooted really in Neoplatonism. So Platonism was a dualistic philosophy, meaning, again, it taught a separation between the physical and spiritual world. But they viewed the physical body as a prison. Basically, your soul was imprisoned in its body, and your goal was to transcend your physical body and sort of ascend to a purely spiritual state. Again, this is very much in conflict with the Christian idea of a resurrected physical body. The new heaven and new earth, your resurrected body, are physical things according to the New Testament. And but again, more and more Christians absorbed these Platonic ideas and began to see the physical body as unimportant and belief that, eternity was a purely spiritual state. Now, one way in which the Christians could agree with Plato is that Plato was very contemptuous of traditional Greek paganism, of polytheism. He did have an idea of a more monotheistic God, though he would not have seen that God as being a personal God. He would have seen it as being sort of an impersonal thing. And he believed that all morals and ethics were contained in a single spiritual principle, which he called, quote, the good. And again, he spoke of the good as being God, but again, it wasn't a personal God. But he did believe that the universe was created by this God, and that this God, who was called the Demiurgos, created the physical world based on these spiritual forms. Plato's student, Aristotle, would take some of those ideas, but move them in a very different direction. But the early church was... especially in the second and third centuries, were much more being influenced by Plato than by Aristotle. You didn't really see Aristotle getting brought in until Augustine, who was 4th century. But Platonism was one of the most popular philosophies of the time, and one of the most dangerous to Christianity. And again, anytime you're reading in the New Testament where Paul, for example, will emphasize that Jesus came in a physical body and you have to confess that he was born of a woman to be truly saved, this is what he's combating. He's combating these Neoplatonic ideas that Jesus wasn't a truly physical being, that he was purely spirit, and that he couldn't have been born in a physical body because that would make him less than perfect. So, again, Paul writes a lot sort of against Platonism. Questions? All right, so to the next on our list of Philosophy 101 is the philosophy of Stoicism. And Stoicism was very popular. It was probably the most respectable of all the early Greek and Roman philosophies. There were very famous, well-respected Romans who were Stoics, like Brutus, the man who betrayed Julius Caesar. He was a well-known Stoic. Seneca was a well-known Stoic. And so it was a very respectable philosophy. It wasn't seen as lower class. The founder of Stoicism was a man named Zeno, spelled Zeno, who lived in the 300s BC. So again, by the time of the early church, these philosophies were usually already several centuries old. But Zeno Zeno was an Athenian philosopher. He taught that the universe was controlled by God. But again, he saw God as being sort of this divine organizing principle. He saw God as more than terms of an idea, and again, more of a non-physical force than any kind of personal being. And in fact, he saw the universe as being a body for God. That the universe was, one organically connected whole, that it was a body, and that God was sort of the soul of the universe. If you listen to a lot of progressive Christians nowadays, people like Richard Rohr and some of the more popular progressive Christian leaders, they draw a lot from this kind of idea. They'll talk about the universe as being sort of God's body, and that God is in everything and part of everything. So Zeno was the first to conceive of God as logos. And logos, of course, is the term used by John to describe Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, being logos. And he was giving the word a new meaning, but he was borrowing sort of the idea of the logos from Stoic philosophy. Not in that he was borrowing the idea of Jesus from Stoic philosophy, but he was expressing Jesus' divinity and his importance in terms that the Greeks and the Romans could understand. He was sort of borrowing their ideas to express something similar but not the same. So Zeno conceived of God as logos, who you could think of as being sort of pure reason. The literal translation is word. But to them, word was the ultimate expression of logic and reason. So that's more or less, he was saying God was reason, sort of as an abstract principle. He also conceived of God as pneuma. That's spelled Pneuma. And pneuma means breath or spirit. And it's the same word that we use for Holy Spirit. That's the word translated as spirit in the New Testament is pneuma. So, as you can see, the New Testament did use a lot of these same words because Paul especially is very highly educated. But again, they weren't borrowing from Greek philosophy so much as using philosophical terms to express new ideas. So Stoicism, like Platonism, believed that the human soul was trapped inside the body, and that our goal was to transcend the body to become pure soul and leave the, evil physical body behind. Stoics also believed that there was a fixed rational plan for the universe. And in fact, later Stoics, instead of thinking of God more as like reason, would think of God as being like fate. That God was the sort of overarching plan for the universe. And therefore, nature had a purpose because it was created by a being, a pure reason for that purpose. And they did believe that because the universe was created by this sort of ultimate reality, that its ultimate purpose was good. They believed that ultimately everything in the universe would work for good. Now, related to this idea of fate was the idea that you didn't control your own destiny. Your life was more or less out of your hands. Nothing you did really mattered. So the goal was to focus on what you could control. You couldn't control what the events around you. You could control your mind, your attitude, your reactions, and your desires. And in fact, we get the word stoic from this. And what does it mean to be stoic? So what?
Stiff-necked.
Yeah, you're stiff-necked. You don't show your emotions. It's the stiff upper lip kind of idea. And that's more or less what they were advocating. Control your emotions, control your desires. That is the only thing you can control. So you must control yourself. And so whatever happiness you could get out of life came from this moral rectitude. It came from living in harmony with nature and accepting your fate. So the idea was to accept whatever life brings you. In fact, any of you ever read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? They talk about Brutus, of course, is a big character in that play. And he doesn't show any emotions when he gets the news that his wife has died. And one of the other character comments how well he reflects his philosophy, because he was a Stoic. He wasn't supposed to break down emotionally. He was supposed to control himself, because he was supposed to accept whatever fate brought him with equanimity. So any misfortune, any pain, any suffering, you are supposed to endure with dignified tranquility. Nothing was supposed to bother you. And this was how you were supposed to live a virtuous and happy life. So in a lot of ways, it was a philosophy of very passive resignation. It was about accepting things. Their main virtues were things like self-discipline, courage, duty, and morality. So again, you weren't, it was not a virtue to go out and try to make the world a better place. It was a virtue to be self-disciplined and courageous and follow your duty and just accept whatever comes. Stoics were big on moderation. You weren't, they didn't indulge. They very much opposed hedonism, any sort of attempt to, be extravagant. Again, you were supposed to be measured in everything. And Stoics were very humanitarian. They did not have a very positive view of humankind. They saw mankind as being imperfect. And because of that, they did believe in tolerance and forgiveness. They believed that we are all, they wouldn't have expressed it as sinners, but they did have something of an idea of that. They were very socially active. They believed in active participation in government and society. Many condemned war and slavery. They were seen as being very moral people, which again wasn't always necessarily seen as a good thing in Greco-Roman society, since a lot of other groups were very hedonistic. But the Stoics were seen as being very moral, very upright people. Probably the best known Stoic, certainly during the time of the church, was Seneca, who basically was born right before Jesus and died right after Paul. So he's kind of spanned the life of the early church. And Seneca was actually well respected by a lot of the early Christians, and there are some theories that he might have corresponded with the Apostle Paul, that they might have actually known each other. Seneca sort of blended Stoicism and Platonism, but he did believe in an all-wise, all-loving, monotheistic God. And he believed that every individual had sort of an inner sense of God. He wrote, God is near you. He is with you. He is within you. This is what I mean. A Holy Spirit indwells within us, one who marks our good and bad deeds and is our guardian. No man can be good without the help of God. So, again, saying things like this, you can see why he was popular with the early Christians, even though what he meant by things like that is not exactly what a Christian would have meant. But a lot of Christians, again, believe that he had been influenced by Paul. that he probably met Paul while Paul was under house arrest in Rome. Though, even though he could say a lot of things, Seneca also, had no problem sort of using his influence to get, special privileges and high positions in court. So he could be a bit of a hypocrite, but, that's pretty much anybody. But nonetheless, he had a lot of respect from the early Christians. And the Stoics, among all the early philosophies, were the ones most respected by early Christians. Obviously, there were major differences. But the Stoics were seen by some Christians as being, close. They were like, they're as close as the pagans can get to God. And, of course, it's very popular among secularists, to portray Jesus basically as a Stoic. And in fact, a lot of people on YouTube and the like will try to claim that Jesus was just an itinerant Stoic philosopher. There was nothing unique about him, that he was literally just another Stoic preacher. And there were a lot of these, there were a lot of itinerant sort of philosophers that would travel around and preach. And a lot of skeptics try to portray Jesus as one of those. Of course, that completely ignores Jesus' Jewish roots. But that's a very common thing among skeptics, to basically forget the fact that Jesus was a Jew and try to portray him, as some sort of Greco-Roman figure or even like an Eastern mystic figure. Questions?
How did they make their living? Were they just...
The what now?
How did they make a living? Were they paid for this?
Yeah, a lot of times you would have people supporting you. You'd have rich followers, or people would pay to... Some of these philosophers would be invited to fancy dinners and paid to speak. They'd be the entertainment for the evening. If you were, if you were a rich Greek or Roman and you wanted to show how intellectual you were, that's the sort of thing you would do. Is, you'd throw a party, you'd invite all your friends, and you'd hire a philosopher to come and like read to you, or give a speech or something like that. And some of them, function basically as beggars. They would beg for money, and people would support them that way. So, there were certainly plenty of opportunities for them to get by. Anything else? So the next one to look at is Epicureanism, which again was very big in the first century, originally founded by the philosopher Epicurus, who lived in the 300s. Now, Epicureanism has gotten a really bad rap nowadays, and for good reason, because even by the time of the early church, it had seriously degenerated. But it didn't start out nearly as bad as it became. Basically, Epicurus was a very practical philosopher. Instead of being really abstract like Plato and spending his time thinking about sort of the ultimate nature of reality, and instead of, being, sort of consumed with social consciousness the way the Stoics were, Epicurus was sort of all about individual behavior, individual morality. He was a deist. He claimed to believe in the Greek gods, but he didn't think they were involved in human affairs. So he believed that the gods are out there, but they sort of had their own sphere. They didn't care what you did, which, would have been shared by a lot of the Greeks and the Romans. In their point, the way they saw it, the gods, didn't care so long as you gave them their proper sacrifices and the like. But practically, he lived and taught more of an agnostic and materialist view. It's because, again, he didn't really care about the gods at all. He didn't see the gods as being any way involved. So there was no such thing as divine providence. God, no God would interfere to help you. He didn't believe in an afterlife. He didn't believe in praying to the gods, because, again, they weren't going to do anything. So he saw prayer as being very foolish, very superstitious. So he really believed that people should live as though any God just didn't exist. He saw religion as something to be avoided. It only, caused problems. And he believed that people were purely mechanistic, that we didn't have any sort of eternal soul, that we really just were sort of machines with no free will of our own. And so when the body died, that was it. Whatever it was about you, once the body was dead, you were gone. Now, the thing Epicurus is really known for, and what really got blown out of proportion by the time of the early church, and why, again, you see people like Paul really warning against some of his philosophy, is that for Epicurus, the standard of truth was pleasure. Basically, if it felt good, do it. That was his philosophy. That is what he taught. Now, he meant that in a sort of different way than it eventually became. He believed that your happiness would lead you into truth, that you would know the right thing to do by what made you happy, because doing right should make you happy. So he didn't advocate hedonism, but he did believe that, your feelings would guide you into truth. He actually advocated moderation. He was like moderation in all things. His followers later, of course, would become famous for just pure indulgence, pure hedonism, just total sensual gratification, because, again, they'd taken his philosophy and twisted it into thinking, whatever I want to do that makes me feel good is good. And that wasn't what he taught. But by the time of the early church, that's what it had become. And basically, Epicureanism was escapism. The idea was to withdraw from your worldly concerns and devote your life to, philosophical considerations. And because the Epicureans were all about, again, by the time of the early church, were all about, if it feels good, do it. They weren't really involved in anything outside themselves. They were very individualistic. And their main preoccupation was just the gratification of sensual desires. Now, Epicureanism was never as respected as something like Platonism or Stoicism for kind of obvious reasons. But again, it was highly influential. You had a hedonistic philosophy, and, this is very much warned against in the New Testament, again, especially in Paul's letters. Paul was directly countering these philosophical claims by people like the Epicureans, that life was about pleasure and life was about, just whatever you felt like doing. It is interesting that Paul never really mentioned any of these by names, but he's definitely countering their claims. He addresses the ideas instead of talking about specific groups.
So how did all these isms grow in popularity? Were there like universities or schools or taught these philosophies?
There were, well-educated Greeks and Romans would be taught various philosophies as part of their education. Again, you would have sort of, itinerant philosophers who would go and teach. You'd have places like Mars Hill in Athens, the Areopagus, where you would go and listen to various philosophers debate their ideas. This is what people did for entertainment, a lot of them. Especially if you were on the more educated side, you would read these works and you would debate. And, you would go and hear philosophers talk. And so the ideas would spread. And usually whatever ideas spread among the elite eventually filter down to the common people. And sometimes they filter down a good bit warped to the common people. And, that's what the early church was really battling. Anything else? So another one was the philosophy of skepticism. And skepticism was popular, especially that skepticism was kind of the pop philosophy of its day. The ancient Greek skeptics were referred to as sophists. And the Greek word sophia means wisdom. So the sophists were people who were, quote, wise, and this is what they called themselves. And this was the pop philosophy of the day. In the same way that nowadays we have like pop psychology, this was sort of their equivalent. And it was very humanistic. Sophists were usually hired as teachers to school the children of the wealthy to help prepare them for public service. And because of that, they were very well versed in rhetoric. They knew how to speak well. And when Paul talks about, vain philosophies and, empty rhetoric, this is what he's talking about more than anything else to the sophists. They were the most widespread. They were very popular because they would get up and they would just have these really fancy rhetorical speeches that would draw people in. And they were very much telling people what they wanted to hear. The sophists were complete relativists. They completely discounted the existence of any kind of absolute truth. And in fact, they were happy to pretty much argue any side of an argument because they didn't believe that truth existed. And so they were very entertaining. And they would draw big crowds. And so they were a particular subject of ire in the New Testament. Again, pretty much anytime you hear talk about vain philosophies or people having their ears tickled or anything like this, they're referring to the sophists. So the basic ideas of the sophists was skepticism. They believed that, very similar to sort of modern day moral relativists, they believed that the only true knowledge comes from the five senses and that all knowledge is subjective and it's limited. So we can't really know anything for sure. That's what they would have claimed. You can't say conclusively either that something is true or false. And so they were relativists. They didn't believe in any kind of absolute right and wrong. Morality varies from one individual and culture to another. And because of that, they were individualists. Self-fulfillment, egocentrism, those were the only goals in life. Because again, only you can know it's true for you. So go out and do whatever you want, basically. You can see why they were popular. Now, again, the sophists had been around for centuries. They had been popular for centuries. And in fact, the great classical Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they were the main opponents of the sophists. Their whole goal was to refute sophistic ideas and defend the idea of absolute truth. Now, whether they had the right idea of what absolute truth is or not, their goal at least was to defend the idea of it against the moral relativism, which was the popular philosophy of the time. Questions? So, possibly the weirdest philosophy, the sort of most controversial philosophy of the day was cynicism. So cynicism wasn't really a coherent worldview. It wasn't so much a philosophy as it was an anti-philosophy. Basically, the cynics were extreme libertarians who celebrated individualism. They believed that people should live naturally. And by naturally, they meant they believed that people should just follow whatever impulse they took them. They were also very satirical about the mores of society. They did not believe in social values, social mores. They believed that truly enlightened people lived with taking no thought to others or taking no thought to any standard of morality. So they were all about, free sex, unbridled free speech. They were major social critics in that, again, they rejected any sort of contemporary values or mores of society at all. A Stoic with, a lot of times would do things just to shock people. They would run around naked, or engage in very scandalous acts right out in the open, just doing things that were designed to shock people. They believed in being very countercultural. They would dress in very coarse clothes. And really their goal was to just, offend as much as they possibly could. And you see a lot of this sort of thing nowadays too. Yeah. Where it's taken as a given that it is a positive thing to shock and offend society. Now, again, cynicism had been founded as not quite an extreme version of this. The original cynics weren't this bad. But by the time you got to the first century of the early church, this is what it had become. Probably the most infamous cynic was Diogenes of Sinope, who lived in the 300s BC. He repudiated, again, all traditional values. He rejected all religious beliefs. And Plato actually called him Socrates gone mad, because he was seen as sort of a madman. But he became one of the most famous of the Cynic philosophers. The last of the sort of major philosophies was Neo-Pythagoreanism. And, you might remember the Pythagorean theorem from school. Same guy. So Pythagoras was a mathematician, yes, but he was also what we would nowadays call a cult leader. I mean, he had his own cult, and they had very weird beliefs. I mean, they're one of those things that, like, you look at what they believe, and they're like, seriously, people believe that? Like, they believe beans were evil, so you shouldn't eat beans, or, just strange stuff. And it was very mystical. It was kind of mathematics-based, but they saw math and geometry as being very mystical things. Pythagoras emphasized asceticism, so a denial of physical desire and a denial of the needs of the body. They were very mystical again. They were very big into numerology. That tied into the mathematics. They believed that numbers were magical things. Like a lot of the other Greek philosophies, they believed that the body was evil and the soul was pure, and that the goal was to rid your soul of its bodies, of the prison of the body. They practiced daily self-examination. They would confess their sins. They would practice mortification of the body, whipping themselves and the like. And, again, this was much more ancient, but there was a big revival of Pythagoreanism in the time, the first century. And this was a big factor that led into Gnosticism later. Where Gnosticism didn't really develop until like the 2nd and 3rd centuries. You see its roots in a lot of these Greek philosophies like Pythagoreanism and Platonism and some of these others. But the basic idea of Gnosticism was gnosis. That's spelled Gnosis, gnosis, which they believed was special knowledge. They believed that there was secret, hidden knowledge that if you possessed it would lead to spiritual enlightenment and salvation. And that was very much an idea brought in from Pythagoras. Pythagoras, taught all his teachings were this secret knowledge, and that if you learned all his teachings, that you could progress to this higher level of existence, basically. So yeah, great with triangles, not so good with other things. Questions? So these were the philosophies of the day. And again, pretty much all of these were in at least some kind of competition with early Christianity. Pretty much all of these are addressed in the New Testament epistles, especially Paul's. But, you see him talked about in Peter and things like that as well, and John. And these were the philosophies, these were the ideas that the apostles and the early church fathers were fighting. And these were the ideas that more than anything else were in competition with Christianity.
So these led to early religions?
Or, again, not religions, because, again, at the time, the people would have seen religion as being sort of amoral. It was philosophy where you got your morality. It was philosophy where you got your idea of how the world worked. Philosophy gave you a worldview in a way that religion back then didn't, except for Christianity. Christianity would have been seen almost as a combination of religion and philosophy because it encompassed all of it. But these were the ideas that were threatening to creep into the church or lure people away from the church completely. And if you read the epistles with these in mind, you can see where Paul and Peter and John are addressing them, where they talk about these kind of different ideas. So, any last questions before we move on? All right, so let's look now at just the social morality of the Roman Empire. Just what was the average morality of the average person? Not a philosopher, not someone in some weird mystery cult, just your average Greek or Roman. What was their idea of morality? What was their idea of how society should work? And there was no real overarching source of morality. Again, Greco-Roman religion was completely divorced from morality for the most part. And with all these different philosophies sort of fighting it out, there was no kind of dominant philosophical source of morality too. But culture has to have morality. You cannot have an amoral culture. Eventually something will come to the fore. We're seeing that nowadays. I think our culture tried to live without morality, and now they're sort of inventing a new morality that's completely contrary to Christian morality. But, nature abhors a vacuum. Where there was no morality, some morality would be invented. And so you see the same thing here. So where did the Greeks and Romans get their sense of morality? Well, they would define it in terms of arete, A-R-E-T-E. And these were the martial values. Basically, the Greeks and Romans got their values, their morality, from the military. So they very highly valued things like patriotism, loyalty, courage, honor, sacrifice, that sort of thing. Those were the highest morals. Those are the things that if you violated, you would truly disgrace yourself. The historian John Kagan writes this: to understand the ancient Greeks and Romans, we must be alert to the great gap that separates their views, and most people throughout history, from the opinions of our own time. They knew nothing of ideas such as would later be spoken in the Sermon on the Mount, and they would have regarded them as absurd if they had. They viewed the world as a place of intense competition, in which victory and domination, which brought fame and glory, were the highest goals. Theirs was a culture that venerated the military values, discipline, hard work, courage, obeying orders, etc. A society that valued power, glory, and domination, and the humiliation of one's enemies. So in many ways, while we can certainly respect some of their values, like, we understand that courage and hard work are good things, the way those values were expressed and many other values are completely alien to our modern day society. Most people don't realize just how much our society has been completely shaped by the Bible and Christianity. And we don't realize how much of a reshaping that was from the values of the Roman Empire. And again, what would have been the values of virtually any other society of the day. for the most part, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, things, that we think are essential values like compassion and mercy and even a love of peace would have been seen not just as foolish, but as outright dangerous to the Romans, because those are the kind of values that got you dominated by your enemies. If the Roman soldier was out there feeling compassion and mercy, he wasn't out there killing Rome's enemies. And their goal ultimately of all their morality was domination. It was the exaltation of Rome and the Roman Empire over everything else. Because life was a competition, Rome was in competition with everything else, and Rome should win. And that was the highest good. And all of their morality was pointed towards that. Now, there were some philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the people who sort of followed them, who were attempting to introduce some sort of higher morality. Maybe not Christian morality, but something much closer to Christian morality. Again, a lot of the early Christians believed that people like Socrates had somehow had some contact with the Old Testament because they thought his values were fairly Christian. But for the most part, they were ignored. And so these higher standards of morals and ethics were very rare. We've already talked about divorce and remarriage being very common. Most families, especially among the higher elite, would have had children born of many different mothers. Again, all a man had to do was to divorce his wife was to say, I divorce you 3 times in front of 3 witnesses, and that was it. This is why even in the Old Testament law, Moses says if you divorce your wife, you must give her a certificate of divorce. And that was to provide some sort of evidence that she had been married and there was a legal divorce and that she wasn't just a shamed woman. Because there was, a woman divorced in this way, couldn't really prove that she had ever been married, even though she had kids. So, again, divorce, remarriage was seen as no big deal. Infanticide was incredibly common, especially toward female babies. It was fairly common if a girl was born to a Roman family, especially if they already had one, for them to just leave her out on the street to die. Or sometimes they may take her out to the countryside and leave her to die there. They said it was called exposing them. But a lot of times you would just, you'd have an unwanted baby, they'd just be left on the doorstep. And this was no big deal. The pater familias, the head of the Roman family, had every right to do this. And it was a common thing. No one batted an eye at it, except the early church. The early church grew at least partially because church members would go and rescue these babies out on the doorsteps and bring them in and raise them as their own. And the Christians were the only ones doing this. Infanticide was so common that you ended up with a mix of about 107 men for every 100 women. So you ended up getting a pretty large gender imbalance. And historically speaking, that tends to lead to more wars, because when you have a bunch of men around who can't get married, they tend to end up in the military. Abortion was very common. Yes, they could absolutely do abortions back then. They were very common, except among Jews and Christians. And in fact, even though abortion isn't directly mentioned in the Bible, there are other early Christian writings like the Didache, which probably dates, at least in part, to the late 1st century, which do directly condemn abortions and say that Christians do not have abortions. So we know that the early church was also very opposed to it. Which, it's interesting because you'll hear a lot of pro-abortion people say, well, the Bible never mentions abortion, so Jesus must be okay with it. But we know from other historical sources that the early church was not. Just because the Bible doesn't mention it doesn't mean the early church supported it. Now, the Romans hadn't always been this bad. Roman morality was a bit better earlier on. And in fact, every now and again, you would have an attempt to sort of return Rome to what were thought of as classical Roman values, where, you might actually value fidelity in your spouse, for example. In fact, in the late 1st century BC, so just before the birth of Christ, shortly after he took power, Augustus Caesar actually made a big push to revive Roman values. Even though his own family was a mess, his daughter was known as being very profligate. And he himself, didn't seem to have much in the way of morals sexually. But he nonetheless attempted to legislate a sexual morality in Rome. He urged single men to marry and produce children. He outlawed orgies. He outlawed adultery by women. Not by men, but he outlawed adultery by women. Because again, the woman being the adulterer was seen as much more of a threat, because then you didn't know where the children came from, and you didn't know who your heirs were and who your heirs weren't. So, not exactly Christian morality, but he was at least attempting to make some kind of return to some kind of morality, because he knew that a complete breakdown of social morality was very bad for social stability. He knew that for the empire to be stable, you needed to have a relatively moral populace. But it was a complete failure. The legislation wasn't going to change Roman culture at all. And by this point, immorality, again, especially among the elite, was very much ingrained in Roman culture. Again, you did have a division. The lower classes would have been much more traditionally moral than the upper classes. But certainly, there was nothing even approaching a sense of Christian morality, especially in terms of sex, when it came to just the Greco-Roman culture in general. Questions? So next time we'll take more of a closer look at sexual morality in Rome. We'll look at homosexuality in Rome. What was the Roman attitude toward homosexuality? It's more complicated than you might think. Look at things like public entertainment, and that will actually wrap up part 2 of the course. It'll wrap up our look at Greco-Roman culture. And then we'll move into the last part, which was on the Jewish wars of the late 1st century, which sort of wrapped up the story of the New Testament.